Before I finish the chapter, there were a couple of words I wanted to make sure you recognize. A fugitive is a person who flees or runs away from justice. A criminal and a runaway are synonyms. There really weren't any good antonyms because this is a noun. It was understood that the dirty, desperate man in front of him were the fugitive killers of Abraham Lincoln. That could be an example sentence. Salvation then came up earlier in the chapter. The community saw the capture of the assassin as their salvation, or the way that they wouldn't be um, harmed anymore, that they were delivered from harm. So, rescue or redemption are synonyms, and downfall or destruction would have been antonyms. So, I'm going to put it back to the question that I wanted us to focus on at the end of this chapter. And I'm at the bottom of 126 on the word as, and then I'll be going to 127. As Jones discussed the escape plan with Booth and Harold, he, 127, became distracted when he heard a familiar and terrifying sound in the distance, clanking metal and horses' hooves pounding the earth. Instantly, Jones recognized the sound. Cavalry sabers slapping the saddles. Ooh, that's some alliteration there. Of Union troops riding in their direction. It was too late for them to try to hoist Booth onto a saddle to attempt escape. A fight was out of the question. Booth could not walk, Jones was unarmed, and Harold had never been in battle before. With only 2 revolvers and 1 carbine, they couldn't hold off a patrol of Union cavalry for long. The 3 men hugged the ground and held their breath. The cavalry horses got within 200 yards. It was Booth's closest brush with capture since he galloped down the alley behind Ford's Theater. Lucky for Booth, instead of running into the thicket, the troops remained on the road past the thicket and rode until the sound of hoofbeats vanished in the distance. Jones locked eyes with Booth. "You see, my friend, we must wait." "Yes," Booth agreed. "I leave it all with you." On the morning of the 17th, another man waited too. Troops still had not called on Dr. Mudd to pursue his tip because they still didn't know about it. It wasn't until the next afternoon that George Mudd rode into Bryantown. He made a vague report to Lieutenant Dana. 2 suspicious strangers visited his cousin's farm seeking medical attention. Then, in another unbelievable stroke of luck, 128, for Booth and Harold, Dana ignored the news as old and unimportant. He thanked George Mudd and sent him on his way. He did not send troops to Mudd's farm to investigate. Distracted by other leads, many of them dead ends, Lieutenant Dana ignored the one tip that placed Lincoln's assassin within his reach. When soldiers had not come by his farm by that evening, Dr. Mudd relaxed. Perhaps at this point they would not come at all. With the assassin's trail in Maryland growing cold, the soldier would soon leave and shift the action to other places far from Bryantown and his farm. Thomas Jones had experienced enough excitement for one day. He agreed to return to the thicket to feed Booth and Harold the next morning, but he refused to bring horse feed again. It was difficult enough to carry feed for the horses, and Jones feared a passing cavalry patrol would hear their horses, which were hungry, restless, and noisy. The horses had served them well, and Harold loved animals, but they all agreed that the horses must be disposed of. The horses' reward for faithful service was death. Harold led them to a quicksand pit about a mile away, shot them, and then sank their bodies. Harold returned to the thicket and sat on the ground beside Booth. Never during their escape were they more vulnerable and alone. If the Union cavalry found them now, they would not be able to make a run for it. Exhausted and, 129, injured, Booth could not hope to outrun a mounted pursuit, and if Thomas Jones abandoned them, how would they find a way across the river? Later, in the safety of the night, Booth and Harold rolled out their woolen blankets and spent another night on the ground. So life isn't looking too good for John Wilkes Booth, but he is still able to keep himself concealed. So in the book, we know that there are things like the fact that communication was probably the biggest thing that showed, or lack of communication showed that this was from 150 years ago. When we think about today, we have phones and we can get instant news right away. But in 1865, that really wasn't that possible. So the lack of communication and just the way that Lieutenant Dana and the cavalry had to run around with all these tips and finding that they were not really valid was a challenge. The story, if it was different, by taking place now, I think that Booth would probably be easier to hunt down because people are more traceable. There are still ways that they conceal themselves, but someone like Booth might, or one of his henchmen especially maybe, wouldn't be smart enough to be able to have like fake IDs or not use their own bank account cards and things like that. So because everything came together so quickly over those 8 hours between when Booth found out Lincoln would be at Ford's Theater and when he actually attacked him, that was a lot to plan out, but then also to try to cover your tracks and to throw someone off today with the way technology and tracking is with cameras and stuff. I think that Booth would have been less likely to have been able to been in the pine thicket and not to be tracked because of the fact that we have a lot more technology and communication available. But there are still people today who are able to stay fugitives, but it is a bit more challenging. All right, I'm going to show you this Willie Clark letter. So Willie Clark, again, lived in the room where they brought Lincoln, and he was out celebrating the end of the war on the night of April 14th, 1865. He returned home the next morning to learn that President Lincoln had died in his bed, and then he wrote his sister 5 days later about the event's impact on his life. So he wrote, "Since the death of our president, hundreds daily call at the house to gain admission into my room. Everybody has a great desire to obtain some memento or item from my room, so that whoever comes in has to be closely watched for fear they will steal something. I have a lock of his hair which I have had neatly framed, like in a picture frame, also a piece of linen with a portion of his brain," oh gross, "the pillow and case upon which he lay when he died, and nearly all his wearing apparel, his clothes. But the latter I intend to send to Robert Lincoln, who is Lincoln's oldest son, as soon as the funeral is over, as I consider him the most justly entitled to them. He believes he deserves them. The same mattress is on my bed, and the same coverlet or cover, bed covering, like a quilt, covers me nightly that covered him while dying, because those things were expensive, and Willie Clark would not have been a rich man." So he kind of seemed like he thought it was an honor that Lincoln died in his bed. So a man recreated some of the most significant events of Booth's journey, and we're going to look at this a little bit more tomorrow, what we noticed, a summary, a reflection, and questions you might have about it, because we've seen some of these man's videos, but not as much about the pine thicket, which I wanted to wait for until we got to chapter 7. So with this one, the video notes we're going to focus on tomorrow. We'll do that whole group. But just think for a minute how you would have felt and reacted if you were Willie Clark. I just want you to reflect on this, being ready to talk about it tomorrow. This is not something that's on the counter for you to complete. I will share my thinking with you tomorrow also, but now that you've heard the letter and that you'll see the video tomorrow, we'll work on this again as a whole group, so that way you can hear other people's answers too. But I just want you to be thinking about how would you have reacted if you were Willie Clark, because I don't know if I would have reacted in the same way as him in his letter to his sister. So for right now, if you meet with me more frequently and don't have a chapter book, you're just doing independent reading. If you're in a chapter book, you're continuing to read or work on your choice board for the rest of reading time, and that's what you'll need to do. When you feel like you're ready, if you have more stuff you need to do for your presentation, you can go ahead and do that. But if you just need to work through your chapter book until I get back after recess time, then you can do that as well. Kind of guide your time, and if you're kind of finished with where you need to be in your chapter book and your presentation, then make sure that you're doing independent reading from a book, not Epic today, unless you're looking in the Civil War collection that I put on there a week ago.